It seems there's a lot of interest when it comes to discussing national broadband strategies and policies, and everybody wants to have their say and have their inputs. I'm just going to give you a quick rundown on how the next couple of hours are going to proceed. First up, we're going to have our guest speaker from the Department of Communication, Mr. Roy Kruger. Roy is the technical advisor to the Minister and has made some major inputs into the broadband policy that was released late last month. And unfortunately, Roy has to catch a plane out of the country, so we're going to give him an opportunity to come up, talk a little bit more around the national broadband policy. What is the vision of the Department of Communication, in this case very specific to the needs of South Africa? How can we achieve ubiquitous access 2020? And after that, we're going to open up to the floor. We welcome any questions. And unfortunately, then we'll have to excuse Roy to catch his plane and to go and attend to some government matters. So after that, we will have everybody else come up and do a 10-minute, very brief introduction on the private sector's view of what this should look like. So that's going to be very interesting this morning. I think, we will kick off. I just want to introduce everybody. To your far right, we've got Dr. Richard Major. He represents SatCom. Just to the left of him is Mr. Carl Brunner. He's with Ericsson. To the left of him, Mr. Mike Silber. Mike is with Liquid Telecoms. To the left of him, Mr. Tsecho Di Tsecho. Tsecho is with Dark Fiber Africa. To the left of him, Tim Nicholas from Alcatel-Lucent. To the left of him, Malcolm Kirby from Metro Fiber Networks. At this stage, Roy, I'm going to hand over the floor to you, and let's kick off. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Just so that we're all on the same page, I'd like to ask, it's a question I normally ask at most of my talks. And because we're talking about fiber optic, which is light driven, my first question to you all is, do you all know the speed of light? Those who don't know, it's 300,000 kilometers per second. So over the last few years, the Department of Communications have been asked to come up with three things to meet the IT or ICT goals of South Africa. And specifically in terms of broadband, we've been asked to come up with a policy document which basically lays out the rules of how we're going to go about rolling out broadband communications to the whole of South Africa. So the stated objective, if you've read the policy, we did release it about 2 months ago for public comment. But the stated policy of the department and the government is that by 2020, we envisage every single citizen of South Africa having access to broadband. And that can be interpreted in a number of ways. Number one, does that mean you sit in your house and you have access, or do you go to the closest internet cafe, or do you walk around with mobile access? So we've had to come up with these kind of policies that try and put the rules of operation into place to drive that target. The second thing that the DOC has been asked to do is to come up with a strategy. And I come from the private sector, and when I look at these kind of documents that the government stroke DOC has to come up with, sometimes it befuddles my mind a bit, because at the end of the day, it sounds like a talk shop. There's a lot of writing and nothing happening. But when you start analyzing these documents, you see that if they weren't in place to start with, the whole place will be in chaos. So over the last few months, we've put together I think it's quite a solid policy document. And although I do read the criticism from some of these journalists, it's easy to talk when you, inverted commas, ignorant about what's happening in the background. But the policy document is quite a solid document. We haven't locked it down yet because we've got public comment until the 15th of this month when we closed that public comment. So now we're busy analyzing those comments, and wherever applicable, we'll include that into the final document. The second document, as I said, is the strategy document, and that is really how are you going to go about getting this network rolled out. It's not the implementation plan. This is just like Who are you going to target? How are you going to target them? Which sectors of society are you going to target? And in the policy document, those who have read it, you would have seen that we're certainly going to be suggesting that Telkom is going to be the major player in this backbone network. So we still, as I say, that's one of the models that we've used. Now, if I just give you an idea of the kind of models that we've come up with, the first thing is to come up with a fiber backbone network. So if I just draw it like this, it's a ring around the country. Model number one is it's owned by Telkom, but by legislation, it will be a wholesale network. And basically what that means is, people asked me the question last week at the minister's budget vote is, well, what does wholesale mean? Well, first of all, wholesale in essence means it's going to be a fairly distributed network. If you want to open up a business and connect into this network, you will pay the same price, a wholesale price, whether you're an individual or whether you're a big company, whether you're based in the north of Limpopo or if you're based down in Cape Town. The price will be the same. It's a wholesale backbone network. And then we need to get the private sector involved. And again, this is just models that we're looking at. We have a number of these things. The private sector can then play on the rural connectivity side of this. So the reason we looked at Telkom is because, as most of you know, they've got over 140,000 kilometers of fiber optic cable, and maybe some needs replacing, but the fact of the matter is they do cover virtually the whole country, and with a couple, probably billion rands or so, we can connect that whole ring and make it a solid network. The private sector, because a lot of the rural areas are not viable to roll out to, the government has to come up with some kind of incentives to get the private sector involved. So again, some of the models we've looked at is, number one, everybody's talking about this high demand spectrum. And particularly in South Africa, they talk about the 800 megahertz and the 2.6 megahertz, or 2.6 gigahertz, sorry. So the minister has been asked over the last couple of years when she's going to release this lot to the private sector. But again, from an ignorant point of view, I see the journalists saying the minister stroke DOC don't know what they're doing. We know 100% what we're doing. So please don't quote us that we don't know what we're doing. We've got some of the best engineers in the market there. We know exactly what we're doing. So when it comes to the 800 megahertz, most of you or some of you will know that that band is used today for broadcasting. Go and speak to MultiChoice and ask him if they're going to give up the 800 megahertz. They're not. They will fight you tooth and nail, as will SABC and everybody using the 800 megahertz. So the minister stroke DOC can't just come along and say, okay, well, we're taking it away, we're giving it to private sector. 800 megahertz will be available once we finish the analog to digital migration, which is probably by mid-2015. So please, you're not getting 800 megahertz till then. The 2.6, the same thing. Some people think this stuff is just lying around and we're not dishing it out. Well, the fact of the matter is WBS owns a huge chunk of that spectrum. Secondly, Centec, until 3 weeks ago, owned a huge chunk of that spectrum. So what must we do? Walk in and just take it away? There's a process. Centec have now given their portion back to ICASA, but WBS hasn't. So what do? We have to try and invoke regulation to clear that band. But hopefully that is going smoother, quite smooth, and in the next couple of weeks, hopefully not months, the minister will make announcements on 2.6 gig. Then the third thing we need to do, so we've done the policy document, we've actually done a strategy document. The third thing we have to do is do an implementation plan. But it's difficult for us because we've been lobbied by a number of groups to say, but we want to be included. And until we actually know what the government's decision is on Telkom, we can't do we've done an implementation plan. In other words, what we've done is we've set targets from the DOC side, so we know what we want. All the numbers are there. But now we're going to have to say, is Telkom going to do that? Is it going to be, model number 2 is a combination of Telkom and private sector in the backbone portion of it. But those guys that are engineers, when you start thinking of linking up let's call it 40 networks, 40 private networks into this backbone. Start thinking about the engineering side. It's pretty easy to interface it, but what about the billing, the logistics behind it, the network management? It's a hell of a nightmare. So, but we've actually put together 3 models, and at the end of the day, the government will choose which one we use, with input from you guys. And I think at the end, it'll be quite a nice network. We've looked at models from Australia. Those guys who've seen Australia, the model itself is pretty good, but phone up Australia today, they'll tell you it's not working. People are not taking it up. In fact, and the price has rocketed from, I think it was $36 billion. I think it's rocketed to over 40 billion. And they're having lots of hassles because people have got infighting. And that's what I see in my mind as an engineer. I see that if we have 40 private companies all connecting to this network, Jesus, I can imagine the fights. So at the end of the day, I think, I'm talking personally here, so if there are journalists here, don't quote it, please. If it was up to me, I would tell South Africa what we are going to do from a government point of view and lay down the rules, and that's it. Then the rest will just fall into place, as has happened in most other countries. Then we've had to also look at the technologies we're going to use here. So of course, the fiber optic will probably be used in the bulk of the backbone network. But I saw this talk is called the last mile. So most of you know the last mile technologies are going to come back to the same thing, being spectrum, if you're going to be using radio technologies. But we've had to have a look at satellite technology. How expensive? Where can we use it? Who's going to be able to pay for it? What incentives will the government put into place for that? The second thing is South Africa is still covered in the, call it the higher income areas, is covered in copper wire. So we've had to look at all the new technologies under copper wire. So most of you know ADSL, which Telkom will tell you as well. I mean, that's 25-year-old technology. Then they came out with the VDSL, which we're just busy rolling out here now. But that's 15-year-old technology. The new technologies, which you might want to start reading about, and which the Alcatel man can talk about as well, is called GFOST. And that's an interim technology between VDSL and fiber to the home. Go and read up on it. If you guys want to start businesses, that's a good business opportunity, because you can get into that last mile copper by coming in with fiber and giving customers speeds of 200 megabits per second. And the closer you get up, if you're within 50 meters of this last device that we put up here, the last fiber device, within 50 meters, we can give you about 180 megabits. Sorry, 1.8 gigabits on that last bit using the GFOST technology. So have a look at GFOST. And then just to finish off with, there's another technology where I'm flying off to now. You've probably heard that Google and Microsoft have been testing what they call TV white space. What that is in the olden days when the ICASA equivalent allocated broadcasting spectrum in South Africa and other countries, they allocated the broadcasters X amount of spectrum, but once they implemented the network, they only needed maybe 90% of that spectrum. So that 10% that's left, and there's a lot of bands that have got it in there, that's called TV white space. And now there are technologies that you can put into there, typically called cognitive radios. And that word, people who don't know it, a cognitive radio is a radio with software intelligence built into it. And there are 2 types that will be available on the market. The first one that they tested down in Cape Town is a database version. So Google went to ICASA and they got all the frequencies that were available, that were free, and they put that into a database, and then they let the radio choose one that's not being used at a specific time, and they transmit data over that. And they were getting throughputs of about 6 megabits per second, so it's pretty good technologies. The other one, technology falling under the cognitive sort of radio systems, is a spectrum sensing system. So what will happen is you'll have a electronic circuit in there which scans the frequencies, and as soon as it finds a free frequency, it allocates it for that data transmission period. So I'm off to Senegal now, where Google is doing a conference on TV white space. But again, an opportunity for people, specifically in the rural areas. It does work in the urban areas, but if you're into RF frequencies, you'll find they haven't tested it thoroughly yet, and we, as engineers, a couple of my colleagues, are expecting some interference, not only on TV interference, but things like microphones, wireless microphones, your remote controls. That hasn't been tested yet. So although TV white space is going to be a good technology for the future, it's not going to be available right now. And I think that's really it from the DOC side. So I haven't spoken too much about the detail of the policies, but it's available on the internet or from the DOC. But if there are any questions, I can answer now or whatever you guys like to hear. Thanks.
Hello, Mr. Kruger. My name is Fred. I'm from a company that manufactures optic fiber cable. One of the problems that we normally encounter when we're deploying fiber is the issue of wayleaves. I see that on the policy it says we're going to have a one-stop shop for the acquisition of wayleaves. When can we see movement on that? Because that will make our lives such a big difference in our lives.
Okay, what we've done is we came up with that policy because we noted that guys like yourselves who are rolling out fiber optic, you hit roadblocks in every single town that you go through because there's a different policy for each town, and some are easy, some are difficult. So we had to look at what are the stumbling blocks in rolling out broadband throughout South Africa. And those wayleaves, all of those kind of things, crossing roads, government infrastructure, I can't even think of all the stumbling blocks, but there are a whole lot. So we decided what we're going to do is set up this one-stop shop, which means you will come to the DOC, or I'm assuming wherever they have a department where you can pick up an application form. You would fill in your route that you're going to be traveling, and by that time we would have negotiated with all the Escoms, SANRAL, the railways and harbours, all these guys, and we would have got clearance from them what the procedures are, so that you as a user would just come to the DOC and submit your application, and we will do the clearance for you. So your question on how far are we with that, we haven't even started, because we still have to wait for this policy document to be locked down and passed by a cabinet. But it, in my mind, if we don't do it by the end of the year, then I wouldn't blame you for saying we don't know what we're doing, but we certainly we are pursuing that.
Good afternoon, Roy. Talan Shetty from Mpanze. The whole long distance fiber optic network, you want to basically bundle it with Telkom. I just want to understand, how does Broadband Infraco fit into this? And also, there's a few other projects going on in the country regarding the long distance fiber optic network. So how do you see this panning out, and what sort of picture can we expect in the future?
Okay, what happened is, for us to start this project off, the department appointed Broadband Infraco as interim. Please note the word interim project managers, so that we could sit around a table and say, listen, this is what it should look like. They do have some experience in fiber, etc. And they were appointed as the interim project manager for the project. However, we've had a lot of feedback from the private sector saying, well, you shouldn't be able to be player and referee at the same time. So at the end of the day, we can see Broadband Infraco. Again, I'm speculating. This is not government. This is my own thoughts, as I think a number of you are able to freely think. Somewhere along the line, Broadband Infraco will be merged into Telkom. That's one model. Or Broadband Infraco needs to go on its own. But the government doesn't want Broadband Infraco and Telkom to duplicate, as they don't want FiberCo or Dark Fiber Africa to duplicate this stuff. So part of before we lock down the policy document and the strategy document, those things have to be sorted out, whether we're going to include the private sector into this ring. So in other words, you might have from point A to point B Telkom, point B to point C Broadband Infraco, and then D to E somebody else. So all of these portions. But like I said to you, my reservation about that is infighting between all these companies to actually get it running smoothly. But we'll see. We haven't analyzed all the feedback from the public comment, but yeah, I think Broadband Infraco, they won't be the final project managers of this thing, because there's too much public feedback or comment that they're playing in the space as a player and a referee.